For over 70 years, Louis XIV ruled France as an absolute monarch, a man who did not just hold power but embodied it. Known across Europe as the Sun King, he styled himself as God's appointed ruler, the radiant center around which all revolved. His palace at Versailles was a symbol of divine authority, with its gilded halls, endless ceremonies, and obsessive rituals all meant to showcase a man more god than king. But by 1715, the golden glow had begun to dim. France was no longer the glorious empire of Louis's youth. The nation had been bled dry by endless wars. The people suffered under crushing taxes and famine, and the aristocracy had grown resentful of a system built entirely around one man's image. And yet, that man refused to change. Louis kept up the full schedule of ceremonies, the morning lever, the evening coucher, the public meals, the symbolic appointments. He walked with stiffness but insisted on standing for long periods in court. He was 76, pale, exhausted, and increasingly withdrawn. But he would not yield. Not to time, not to age, not even to the growing sickness that had begun to take root in his body. What began as a nagging pain in his left leg in July was dismissed as strain. But it worsened. The leg swelled. The pain deepened. Still, he carried on, limping to the throne, dragging his robe down Versailles' vast corridors, the faint scent of rot beginning to follow him like a shadow. His doctors, men like Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, prescribed the usual 18th century remedies: bleeding, enemas, purging, herbal poultices. Nothing helped. In fact, the pain grew worse. The leg began to blacken. The odor intensified. And by August, whispers began to ripple through the palace. The Sun King was dying. Not majestically, not gloriously, but grotesquely, inch by inch, consumed by gangrene that turned his once mighty body into a living corpse. Still, he refused to stop court rituals. He refused to cancel audiences. He refused to admit he was human. The most powerful man in Europe had become a vessel of rotting flesh pretending he still ruled the world. Candle Part 2. The rot spreads. By the second week of August, the king's leg had become a horror in itself. What began as discoloration had turned into something nightmarish. The flesh darkened to black and green. Pus oozed from open sores. The smell could no longer be disguised with the finest perfumes of France. Courtiers recoiled when near him. Servants begged to be reassigned. And yet, Louis insisted on the same formal routines. Each morning, his valet helped him into his royal attire, wrapping the leg in silk and lace to hide its decay. But there was no hiding it anymore. The air in the palace grew thick with rot. People fainted. Pets howled. Tapestries had to be removed from the king's room because they absorbed the stench. Still, he clung to his role. He held audiences, gave orders, even as his teeth loosened, his skin grayed, and he forgot names. His physicians, now desperate, suggested amputation. But removing the infected leg with 18th century tools meant sawing through bone with no anesthesia. It would likely kill him instantly. Louis refused. They tried leeches. They tried hot iron. They prayed. Nothing worked. The infection spread to his groin, then his torso. The gangrene marched like an army through his body. Religious relics were placed near him. Monks were summoned to chant prayers beside his bed. But still the rot spread. It was as if God himself had turned away. The courtiers began to fear not just the king's death, but his dying. It seemed to stretch endlessly, grotesquely. He would drift into delirium, screaming for dead relatives. Then suddenly regain clarity and demand to know why his slippers were not aligned properly. He was trapped in a
decaying body but still tried to act like a god. Versailles, once the symbol of absolute monarchy, had become a haunted palace. In its golden halls, they now watched a man decompose while still alive. And no one, no doctor, no priest, no prince, could do anything but pretend that everything was fine. They bowed, smiled, and inhaled death with every breath.
The final weeks were worse than death. Louis could barely eat. His mouth was full of sores. His teeth rotted and fell out. His breath stank of something no perfume could mask. He could no longer move without agony. His organs began to fail. His urine turned dark. His bowels emptied without control. Still, the royal court continued its rituals. His meals were served by dozens of staff, though he now drank soup through a straw. His bed linens were changed several times a day, each time with the full ceremonial performance, witnesses, noblemen, and exact etiquette. But now those sheets were soaked with foul-smelling fluids. The servants began to cry. Some vomited. Many left Versailles and never returned. The remaining few, driven by fear, loyalty, or tradition, endured the daily horror of dressing, feeding, and cleaning the king who had become a walking corpse. Versailles itself seemed cursed. The once vibrant palace became a place of dread. Visitors spoke of the unbearable stench, of moans echoing down the marble corridors, of shadows in candlelight that seemed to flicker and follow. Religious officials tried to make sense of it. Was this divine punishment? Was the king's suffering penance for his arrogance, his wars, his mistresses, his godlike pride? They performed masses. They touched him with relics. They whispered verses over his fetid limbs. But the rot continued. The gangrene now covered most of his body. One priest, unable to contain his horror, fled mid-ceremony and was never seen again. Louis sometimes sobbed like a child. Other times he gave commands to people who weren't there. He called out to his dead son. He cursed invisible enemies. Then he would snap back into lucidity and ask whether the curtains had been drawn precisely to the east. The few remaining courtiers tried to maintain the illusion. But their faces were pale. Their eyes hollow. They were no longer watching a king. They were witnessing something beyond nature. A man who refused to die, even as death consumed him from within. By early September, the palace began preparing for the inevitable. The air in Versailles was so thick with the scent of decay that it clung to people's clothes. Those who came to court carried handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or rose oil just to endure their time in the royal wing. Doctors ceased treatment. The king could no longer recognize his ministers. He lay on his bed, covered in silks that now served only to hide what lay beneath, a body that had ceased to live in any meaningful way. When he was lucid, Louis finally acknowledged the truth. He spoke to his great-grandson, the 5-year-old Dauphin, and whispered advice: "Do not imitate me in my taste for building. Seek peace. Relieve your people." These words, so different from the pride of his youth, were his final recognition that he had not been a god, but a man who had played one too long. On September 1, 1715, after 23 days of agony, Louis XIV died. The Sun King, who had ruled France longer than any monarch in history, had been reduced to rot, delirium, and despair. His death marked not just the end of a man but the symbolic collapse of divine monarchy in France. When the news spread, the court did not erupt into mourning. Instead, silence. A heavy, terrifying silence. What they had witnessed in those final weeks had shaken their faith in everything they believed. The divine right of kings, the holiness of monarchy, the invincibility of power, all had been reduced to maggots and pus and the overwhelming stench of mortality. In the days that followed, embalmers tried to preserve his body. But it was already too far gone. They wrapped it in spices, herbs, and heavy cloth, but still, the stench filled the cathedral during his funeral. Peasants who came to pay their respects held
their noses. Diplomats noted that he smelled like hell, and perhaps that's where many believed he had gone. The golden age of Versailles was over. The palace would never again shine as it had under Louis. And as France stumbled toward revolution decades later, many would recall how the Sun King had died, not in glory, but in rot. His legacy forever tainted by the image of a king who refused to die, a god who turned into a corpse, a symbol of absolute power unraveling before a horrified world.
You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.